right, and now it shall load from Zoom to YouTube.
All right.
It says it's live.
And I, of course, always get a commercial.
Should I use my mic? Does that make things better? Or are you picking me up okay?
I think we can pick you up
sound okay.
okay.
Okay, fine. Okay, all right.
All right, awesome. Are we live, Vance? Mine, I'm
Yes,
getting
we're live.
I'm getting a commercial.
Sorry about that. Okay.
Oh, that's okay. That's okay. These things are far from perfect because we all go live in different times of the world and different browsers. So it's an imperfect. It's not like the legacy media. But regardless, welcome to the desert of the real. Welcome to another episode of Aeon Byte Live. And as always, we'll wait till people start congregating in the chat room. But as always, it's an honor to have Gary Lachman on the show. And he is here to discuss his new book, great read, The Return of Holy Russia, Apocalyptic History, Mystical Awakening, and the Struggle for the Soul of the World. Gary, welcome as always. Good to have you on.
Well, it's very good to be on again. And thank you very much for inviting me.
Oh, pleasure is all ours. And with us too, we've got the Moondog Vance. Vance, how you doing?
I'm pretty good. I'm really rushing to hear all about Holy Russia.
Yes,
Right.
the puns have arrived.
Yes, always have to have one.
All right, awesome. So, wow, I'm still not getting mine live. I'm sure we are live. Let me make sure. Yes, there we are. Finally. Okay, good. Well, as always, first let's do the typical house cleaning. I'll have to repeat it as more people congregate into the chat room. This is live, so if you have any questions for Gary, please write them down with lots of question marks or in caps. That way Vance can pick them up and then we can forward them to Gary. This is live, and as always, it will be on YouTube, and the audio version in about 24 hours or so will be available on all channels, iTunes, iHeartRadio, everything. The audio version for patrons and members, as always, there will be a bonus. For this show, the bonus will be Gary and I's last interview where we discuss Dark Star Rising, which I feel the book and the interview are complementary to this work right here, as you will see. So, but without further ado, and then we'll worry about other house cleaning or projects. Gary, what happened? Why did you decide to write this book? I know we kind of touched upon this in our last interview, but maybe tell the audience how this book came to being.
Well, you mentioned Dark Star Rising, and it basically came out of that because there's a good part of Dark Star Rising that is about Russia, having to do with Surkov, who was Putin's PR man and ran this kind of virtual reality Russia for several years, but also about a fellow named Alexander Dugin, who I say has a very strange trajectory. I mean, he started out as in the 1980s as an anti-Soviet punk, and through a career of many different sorts of quick change, costume, political ideologies. I mean, I don't know if he still occupies this position, but he was lecturing to the sort of general staff of the Kremlin on geopolitics. So, and a lot of his ideas, it struck me, were informing some of Putin's decisions. And all that just came out of doing the reading to do the book about Trump and magic and politics. It seems to have come back in. And then at the end of that book, I thought, yeah, there's a lot there left to do about Russia. And I originally was going to focus on an idea that I write about in Dark Star Rising, about this notion of Eurasia. And I mean, I had an early idea for the book was Eurasian Dawn, but then I thought that sounded like an exotic dancer. So I decided not to go with that title. But then I also thought that I'd written quite a bit about Eurasia in Dark Star, and didn't want to wind up repeating. So I mean, it's in Holy Russia. It's there. It's a thread that runs through it, and that's the connection with it. And I just and the other spur for that, I mean, that I felt like, yeah, there's a lot there. You know, there's another book there. But the sort of trigger to actually try to put it together was, I think it was 2015, 2014. Putin gave out a reading list to his regional governors. It was one of the annual meetings of United Russia. And on the reading list were some people that I had read. I mean, I don't read Russian, speak Russian, anything like that. I'm not a Russian expert, but I've read in English translation, you know, quite a bit of sort of Russian philosophy and literature and things like that. So, but he mentioned people like Nikolai Berdayev, who I had read, and Soloviev, and someone that I didn't know about, Ian Ilyin. He mentioned him as well. But it just struck me as interesting that, oh, well, you know, how many world leaders talk about these sort of obscure philosophers, you know, or suggesting to their governors to read them. And then I saw the response from people like David Brooks in the New York Times and some other Western critics, where, I mean, perhaps understandably, you know, they're not going to be very subtle about it, but they're basically saying that these are these messianic Russian exceptionalist philosophers at the end of the 19th and early 20th century who had this vision of a kind of Russian, you know, culture spreading out over the world in a certain way, and they saw it as very kind of aggressive and that sort of thing. And yeah, there's an aspect to that, but that's not really what's at the heart of it. Now, I just thought it was a rather ignorant some kind of response, and so I thought, well, actually, you know, these guys are quite interesting. Soloviev is very interesting. He's informed, you know, whole sort of side of esoteric philosophy, and that was it. So from that, it just led to, and why is it Holy Russia? Like, it's not, you know, you don't really hear Holy France, or, you know, I mean, not that you haven't heard things like that, but there is a peculiar identity to, you know, Russia being holy, and I just wanted to understand what that was, and that was the real germ of the book.
Yeah, it was an excellent journey. I loved your book. Again, as you always say, you are a scholar of the history of consciousness, and this was a journey into the entire consciousness of Russia. I mean, most people are aware of the Western consciousness based on the Greco-Roman. We, of course, have the Persian consciousness, the Asian consciousness, but there seems to be a big, really ignorance about what is the Russian consciousness, and you do an excellent job. I love your idea of the history of meaning, and this is important, and it's something isn't as very alien to us in the West, but pretty normal to the Eurasians.
Well, this was something that certainly saw in the second half of the book. Again, it's a thread that runs through where, I mean, the whole notion of what Russia's picking up from the West. This is a theme that's running throughout the book as well. And there's certain philosophies that they're adopting. Obviously, you know, Marx, but that's later on. But Hegel and Schelling. Schelling was someone who was very big in Russia. He doesn't get as much press as Hegel did and all that. And Schelling's particularly, it's a philosophy of sort of the Romantic movement, and it has more to do with meaning. It has more to do with that side of our being, rather than the analytical Enlightenment, you know, critical inquiry and you know, rationalism, which, you know, we have the world that we have today. And so it's something that somehow in Russian philosophy starts at the latter end of the 19th century. It's saturated with this kind of pursuit, the kind of what we would consider existentialism. It's kind of like a pre-existentialism, because it's dominated by the ideas of, you know, what's the purpose of life, and human life in particular. And this is something you get from Christianity as well. And you see this in, you know, Tolstoy and Dostoevsky, but it's in Solovyev's philosophy and Berdyaev's. And it's something that's in many ways radically anthropomorphic, but in a kind of spiritual kind of sense. And this is something that is very different than the West. You know, the West doesn't, you know, just doesn't see that or sees that as a kind of muddle-headedness or something like that. So there's a detached, you know, character to Western engagement with the world. And again, that's the polarity that's in the book. And Russia, at the end of the 19th century, was supposed to have embodied this union between these two sides, which, you know, we can see operating in many ways around us. And then that was a stillbirth, or it didn't have the opportunity to really happen because of the Bolshevik Revolution. But now, you know, a century later, as it were, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, that's all that is being reclaimed, and that's something that Putin's been doing, at least in what I've read about it, that he's been incorporating ideas from this period called the Silver Age, that was very, very different than what was going on in the West. It was very mystical and interested in the occult and things of that sort.
Yeah, Gary, we're having a little bit of, are you hearing that too, Vance? Gary's mic is a little scratchy.
Yes, I am hearing that.
Okay.
Can you switch
right.
mics easily?
I can put on a mic. Just give
It
me a
sounds
sec.
good too. It kind of comes and goes.
Yeah,
Okay,
when you
maybe-
first talk,
maybe I'm-
yeah, it's smooth.
Maybe I'm
But then
moving around too much. That could be it. Okay, sorry, folks. Just hold on for the.
Oh, that's okay.
Okay.
It happens
Yeah.
more.
It's live.
It's live. Yeah, it's not Memorex, and I showed my age by saying that.
Well, I know what you mean. So.
All right. Well, it should be better. And
Okay.
we'll
How
just
is that? How is that? Hello.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay.
Yeah.
can hear you.
Okay.
All right, awesome. Well, hopefully this will fix it, and it's not a lag internet. If things get worse, the one thing, the last trick we do is you just turn off your video and we go audio only, which is just
Okay.
fine because that way it takes less bandwidth. But we'll play it by ear. So to my
Okay.
next question, and everything well said, fascinating. So I guess the question, which is important to your book, and again you keep revisiting this as we get an idea of what the Russian psyche is and the Russian mythology and so forth. But you talk about this very important concept: who is the Russian man? And I love how you talk about. I'm trying to think of my notes. Was it Spengler or Wilson who talks about how the Western man looks up at the cathedrals and so, but the Russian man is always looking out at the steps, and that's a huge distinction.
Yeah, that's Spengler in the Decline of the West. And he says the Western ego, the Western eye, like it looks up into the sky, sort of in the soaring Gothic towers, or an emblem of that. But the Russian soul looks out. It's this kind of horizon-oriented sight, and across the vast plains, the endless steppes, and that kind of thing. And he talks about it having, what does he call it? It's the Magian, I think, is what he says is the Russian, if I remember exactly, or the Magian. It's this kind of the world dome. It's this notion of a kind of world dome, whereas the Western is more, infinity, endlessness. And so you have like the great, Hagia Sophia in Constantinople, and it's still there in Istanbul, but there's this wonderful sense of this dome. And this is something that when Prince Olga goes from Kiev to Constantinople, she's already converted to Christianity, but she wants to go there. It's an envoy. It's political reasons as well, but she's going for her religious pursuits too. And she's completely overwhelmed by the beauty, precisely in that dome, that kind of world dome with all the glittering lamps and the icons and things of that sort. So that's one of the distinctions too. I mean, a Russian man is a term that I get from Hermann Hesse. I mean, others at the time were talking about it too. Steiner has a couple of lectures about Steiner, and I mentioned him too in this part of the book. But it's this idea he comes up with, or this way of describing that this character based on reading Dostoevsky, and it's mostly the brothers Karamazov and the Idiot. But it's this notion of Russian man is this huge, capacious soul that can embrace opposites and polarities and antinomian to the hilt. And so you get this notion of like Rasputin, the holy devil. I mean, a more maybe the Hells Angels motorcycle gang is a kind of expression of this antinomian sense as well. I mean, and it runs through much of the occult and kind of the radical, transgressive, counter world. But this is something that the Russian man is able to embrace, and he's sinner and saint, he's poet and drunkard, he's judge and criminal, And and he has this wonderful line about it's this kind of terrible, indiscriminating sanctity, or something like that, where everything is holy, even the most vile kinds of behavior, because you transcend that and all that. And Hesse, as Spengler was saying at the same time, he felt like Europe was in decline, was at its end. I mean, it was, it wasn't an uncommon idea. You have Max Nordau's book, Degeneration, published in the 1890s. That's kind of saying the same thing from a more clinical kind of point of view. But Spengler doesn't see any chance of renewal. Hesse thinks there can be renewal if we're able to embrace this character. And this is part of this whole polarity and the bringing together that's supposed to happen between kind of the Western logical European mind and the Russian, which is sort of half Asiatic, and it's this chaotic blend of potential and all this kind of thing. And again, this is part of this third way that was somehow supposed to emerge, that was everyone was kind of expecting, and then the Bolsheviks came in and scotched that.
And also important, you quote early on, you called Rudolf Steiner and his views of Russia. How did he see the Russians or the Russian man? I mean, can we say Blavatsky maybe embodies the Russian man? I mean, even in our interview on Blavatsky, you talk about you had this mystic who was smoking and eating butter. Basically, it was just this contradiction of characters, just profane and holy at the same time. I mean,
no, absolutely. I mean, I say in the book that when Steiner is talking about Russian man, he points to a Russian woman, in fact, as an example, and it is Madame Blavatsky, who he calls a very cheeky creature. That he's tactfulness incarnate. So I mean, Steiner is very gentle and all this kind of thing, but he points to her as being this madcap and this character who had tremendous insight and charisma and power, but was explosive and uncontrollable. And this is something that Berdyaev says about the Russians. I mean, a book that I got a lot from is this wonderful book by Berdyaev called The Russian Idea. And this was kind of his philosophical, spiritual history of Russia. And, Berdyaev is an interesting character himself. He contained these contradictions. I mean, he was a Marxist, but also a Christian, an existentialist, and he was a kind of spiritual anarchist. And I mean, he was very well read in the sort of the 30s and 40s, and not so much anymore. But he said that the Russian had this primeval kind of eruptive force, but it didn't have any kind of sense of boundaries or order or any kind of structure, and it lacked that. And it was just this kind of turbulent kind of power. And you can see some of them like Blavatsky. And I was going to say Gurdjieff, even though we know Gurdjieff wasn't Russian ethnically, but he came to prominence in Russia. And Gurdjieff himself was, he was another, again, he was different than Blavatsky, but they were similar in the sense that he did have this disruptive kind of character at times. And some of his, and he too, like Blavatsky snared Colonel Olcott to kind of be her front man. And he was a very sober, earnest, good speaker and all that, an organizer. And Gurdjieff got Uspensky, who was a very westernized Russian. And Uspensky is more sophisticated than Olcott, but it kind of serves a similar kind of purpose in that sense. So that's one of the things too. So there's this kind of, and I'm sure to some Russians, they're probably thinking all these kind of, cliches, but, it just seems to be the case. But this kind of, at the same time, you have this destructive kind of power, and then there's also kind of somnolence, this kind of, the sort of Oblomov character who sits by the stove all day, or takes a chapter to get him out of bed. And I kind of say, well, you can sort of see this in the history as well, where you have this kind of, primal kind of power, but it is kind of lethargic, and then you have the Ivan the Terrible, so these kind of catastrophic figures who just give it a real nasty kick. And but again, one of the things I loved about doing the book is that I learned some of the history of Russia. I mean, I didn't really know anything outside of just around the revolution, I guess, or the period, the Silver Age, which I was familiar with because I wrote about a book about Uspensky and so on, because he came out of that milieu before he met Gurdjieff. But then just to understand this whole history And then to read back up to people that I did know, like Dostoevsky, then I can understand in a sort of deeper way some of the motifs and themes that are going on in Dostoevsky's books, and especially that line about beauty will save the world, which takes us back to the icons and all of that kind of experience. Because this is something there's this whole yearning for this transformation, this transformative apocalypse in some way that's going to happen, and that seems to be something that is very much part of that character. Again, Berdayo talks about that a lot.
Wonderful. Well said. Yeah, Gary, do you want to, are you still hearing a little stick there, Vance? Yeah. Do you want to turn off your video and see if that helps? We'll just do
I'm sorry
audio.
about all this.
Oh, that's
I'm
okay. It
sorry about
happens.
that.
It's the internet.
Okay, let me see how do I get to there? Let me see.
Let's see at the bottom, if you hover, you'll see your stop video.
Oh, I see, stop video. Okay,
Yeah,
all right.
try that and let's see
I'm
if that
sorry
helps.
about that.
Oh, that's okay. We'll just do audio only.
Okay, I'm clicking on stop video, but it isn't stopping yet. Oh, there we go.
All right. Hopefully that will help.
Okay,
But
well.
yeah, wonderful. And I think you talked about Olga, and it seems what I'm getting in your book is that seems to be really the birth of Russia and modernity, is when you had Princess Olga, who was this basically pagan princess who goes down to Constantinople and sees the wonders of this very exotic civilization, and as this pagan woman meets the really sublime view of the Greco-Roman world that it's now Christianized. And I would say it's that meeting where you could say that Russia was created, at least the spirit of Russia was created. Wouldn't you agree with that, Gary?
Well, yeah, I mean, I would say this is sort of a turning point in, I mean, it becomes official with her grandson, I believe, Vladimir first, but she's the one who pushes for it. I mean, they had sent out missionaries before, but this was something where it was brought back, and she wanted to bring the beauty that she saw in Constantinople back to Kiev, and a lot of the construction that went on after that was based on trying to copy parts of Byzantium, basically. And this whole notion that she was just overwhelmed by the experience and all that. And then later, when sort of Vladimir was checking out, deciding, where to go, because there was competition. There was Western Church, and there was Islam as well. And the story is that he sent out some emissaries to go and check each of these out. And they said, well, no, Western Christianity is okay, it just seems a little dull. And Islam, we can't drink, so we can't do that. And but nothing surpassed the beauty that we saw in Constantinople. We didn't know where we were. We believed we were on heaven on earth. I'm paraphrasing it, but it was this expressions of that. Again, it was this notion. And you have to remember, I mean, okay, this is 1,000 years ago, but still they're being sent out from Kiev itself, which wasn't, it wasn't a mud hut, it was, and these are kings. These are, people living the highest standard of living you could at the time, and they're impressed. They're impressed by, this other place, and then that was this thing. And again, the icons were seen as these transformative, I mean, they weren't just sort of, they were a way to communicate and actually show, rather than convince through any kind of, talk or argument. This is what it's going to be like, and they would show you this fantastic, painting. It glittered in these colors that just seemed transfigured to them. And so this was another thing that sold the idea.
Yeah, I think, I think, well, as you just mentioned, Dostoevsky talking about how beauty will save the world. It almost seems like that Neoplatonist idea with beauty met with this sort of, I don't want to say more savage or pagan culture, and this infused really, I think, the Russian spirit in it, and then it would definitely go on. And as your book talks very well, Gary, you talk about really the people that influenced Russia, and it wasn't just the Slavics or the Rus like Olga, but it was earlier Vikings who were pretty savage and all that. I don't know. You mentioned this ritual called the blood eagle, and I don't know if you've seen the movie Midsummer.
I haven't seen it yet. No.
Okay, well, it does show the ritual right there, with the very gruesome ritual where they open the guy's ribs and they put out his lungs, and he's back. Oh,
yes. Well, apparently this is what the early Vikings that were invited, Rurik. I mean, the story is you had I guess, indigenous Slavs are there, and they've made these settlements, but they can't keep it together. They're not very good at order. Everything is kind of messy and all this sort of thing, and they need some kind of rigor and order to come. And so they invite these Vikings, say, hey, once you come here, you can rule over us. We'll feed you. We'll give you this. We'll treat you really well. So instead of coming and raiding us all the time, you can actually be here. We'll take care of you, and you can protect us from these other people who coming and raiding all the time. And we're like, okay, sounds good. So he takes it, and then this is supposed to be the beginning. And this is depending on your point of view, this is actually part of the tradition of what it means to be Russian, or it's this kind of propaganda that is used by people like Putin or whatever, the more progressive sort of strain in Russia at the time, to say, this whole idea that the Russians are inherently chaotic and can't keep it together, and they need some outside, authority to come in, basically an authoritarian figure to come in and give them some order, is a myth that is used to, propagate that order. But this seems to be the case. I mean, it's debated whether that really happened, how much is myth and all that, but that's sort of the story. And then from there, there's the move down south, down towards the Black Sea and Kiev and all that, and the encounter with, Constantinople and that world, which the first time they meet, it's as a raiding party. They're attacking Constantinople and all that, and then they sort of win that one. There's another time when Constantinople, they prepare for them, and they have Greek fire, and they're able to hold them off with, the Greek fire was this weird flammable kind of incendiary weapon that they flung onto the ships and all that. And but then gradually, again, they made a deal, and they said, okay, well, look, rather than, why don't we all work together? And Vladimir says, okay, but I want to marry into the family. He wants to marry into the Roman sort of family and all that. This is something that wasn't done, but they finally, kind of agree, and it takes them a while. They agree in principle, but it takes them a while before they send, his wife, and meanwhile he has, like, I don't know how many thousands of his warriors are actually in Byzantium. It's sort of like, well, if you don't send her now, I'll release the Kraken, as it were. I'll release the, and okay, and they finally agree, and then he is baptized, and then he goes and brings it back to the rest of the country, and then goes throughout, all the cities and enforcing the new gods.
Yeah, and Vance, any questions from the audience for Gary?
I had one from Ian, which dealt with the influence of Slavic pagan culture and whether it still influences the Russian spirituality. I think you touched on that to a large degree, but what else do you have to say about that, Gary?
Well, I mean, it's something that's like many things that were sort of obscured or put out of the way during the Bolshevik time. It's made a comeback. I mean, I know there are several different variants of a kind of native pagan religion emerging in Russia now. There's Anastasianism was one kind of variant of that, and then there's some just basic, ones that are calling native pagan, and a kind of Slavic. I mean, I talk about that in the end of the book. It's more like, okay, here's some signs that Holy Russia has come back. So it's as far as I can tell, it's very alive, and it's actually spreading, in the sense that other countries, and I guess the near abroad, or into Eastern Europe, are picking up on it as well. It's supposed to be very popular in the States, I was going to say. Apparently this Anastasianism is supposed to be very, very popular in the States.
Oh, really?
So,
wow.
That's what I've heard, so I don't know.
And then all through the Soviet era, since the Bolshevik Revolution and so forth, they allegedly suppressed religion because it wasn't part of Marxism. But what do you know about, what was really going on during all that time? They always still had churches and services and so forth, didn't they?
Well, I assume I don't get into that so much in the book. It's more about actually it was kind of pushed out of the way. So I assume it had some kind of hidden underground life, but I don't talk about that per se in the book so much.
Okay.
Yeah, we want to get into the you might say metaphysics of the Bolsheviks, because it's important to see about that. But going back to the history of Russia, then as you say, you had Kiev becoming Christian. That was sort of the Russian capital. But then things moved to Moscow, and that happened with what? Oh, that happened with the Mongol invasion. Isn't that what basically, again, that huge shift in the history of the Russians?
Well, that happened after the Mongols.
No,
That
it
was
was
kind of
after.
the next
I
empire.
thought they
Yeah.
raised Kiev, according in your book.
No, the Mongols came and that was it. That's kind of, I mean, I sort of refer to it kind of in a kind of way. It's a sort of, it's that Kiev period is kind of the King Arthur
Right.
and the Round Table, equivalent in a certain sense, because there is this kind of sense that too is a kind of mythic time that's looked back to as this kind of golden age of knights and chivalry and heroes and that sort of thing. And then it's swept up by the Mongols. But then after, when the Mongols are finally, they're not so much driven out as that they kind of drive themselves out, because there's sort of factors working within the Great Horde and the Golden Horde that kind of just eventually, basically the Khan, who was still demanding tribute, he gets offed by another Khan, and then they just kind of lose interest, and then the whole the horde breaks up itself. And then at that point, Moscow starts to, I mean, it already has been, but it emerges out of that, when the yoke is finally broken, it emerges as the new power. And then that's the whole idea of the Third Rome, that it's picking up after the final, long awaited and long expected collapse of Constantinople to the Turks in 1453. Then it takes on the mantle of the Third Rome. And I guess that too is what feeds into this notion, this sort of messianic history, or sense of historicism in the Russian character, the Russian journey, whatever you want to call it. That yes, there's this, and again, it's a kind of straight line, sense of history. There's a goal, there's some kind of climax, and it's moving on towards that.
Yeah, as you're right. There was before the pagan time when history sort of cyclical, but once Christianity is infused into the Russian mind, then it's like you said, there's a beginning and then there's a glorious end, we hope.
Well, the parallel I make is if, and then you get to we talked about Spengler before, how he sees, the Russians looking out, across the vast plain, and then you get the notion of the pilgrimage, this kind of endless journey, walking, endlessly. I mean, Rasputin, walked to Mount Athos, and then he took in the Holy Land as a side trip or something. I mean, this is just, I read this, did he really do that? And I look in another book and I look in another book and I think, my God,
like 900 miles or something.
Oh, it's just enormous, and then, and there's others who are doing these, and again, so there's that sense of vast, endless plains and distance, but it is kind of like, it's a pilgrimage journey, to something, to some holy spot and somehow. So it just seems to me there's a parallel between the kind of spatial, expression of that, the actual pilgrimage, and then this temporal, historical one where it's, well, there's the whole cliche, life is a pilgrimage itself, but then this notion that history was heading towards something. It was heading towards some kind of, climax. And that's something that's still, I mean, in some degree, at least in the form of, say, like Dugin, who he churns up a lot of rhetoric with that kind of those kinds of ideas. Yeah, so it seems to something that's still there, you know.
Yeah, and talking about you might say one of the climaxes of the Russian man, and you put a lot of work into or give a lot of attention, is that of Ivan the Terrible. Again, this sort of ruler who was again this weird duality. He was believed in the arts and very religious, wanted to become a monk, but on the other side, he had a huge sex drive, and he was a murderer, and it was just, he represents not only the Russian man, but as you bring up Colin Wilson's concept of the right man.
Yes, yeah. So I was going to say he's an example of this character or personality that Colin Wilson calls the right man, and he got the idea from the science fiction writer A.E. Van Vogt, who wrote about a novel called The Violent Man. And it's a personality profile of someone who can never admit to being wrong, and will go to great lengths to insist and secure that he is right, and will become violent when confronted with resistance, and so on and so on. And he says, Ivan the Terrible is one of these characters that somehow in world history seem to rise up into these positions of power in which they can exercise that character to great length. And yes, and he was a complex character. You pointed out that he was interested in the arts and learning. He promoted education and things of that sort, but he apparently took great delight in seeing those whom he thought were plotting against him tortured. And I guess one of the, can you say, truly horrific things was when he walled in the city of Novgorod. It was some apparent slight, and massacred something like 40,000 people. And I say in the book, Ivan the Terrible is supposed to be like a mistranslation of the Dreaded. But he's the dreadful Ivan, but that's still pretty terrible. I'm sorry, I don't mean to make a horrible joke out of that, but around that time, he was also, he had astrologers around him and a variety of other, soothsayers and things of that sort. And it was a time when it was more or less a theocracy, the country, because it seemed to be, there was this strange kind of relationship between the monasteries and the secular life, and they kind of crossed paths at different sorts of times, where the actual everyday life is becoming more and more like like that of a monastic life. The seriousness and kind of enforcement of following religious rules and all that. This was quite remarkable. And then actually in the monasteries themselves, they were quite getting drunk and having sex and all that. Apparently, later on, Rasputin, but the story is Rasputin, when he went to Mount Athos, he was revolted at what the monks were getting up to, and he left and all that sort of thing. So I don't know, but yes, it's strange. But you talk about that, you talk about the monasteries, this is the whole idea where Russia seems to have spread out. There was this kind of religious kind of colonization, because what happens, the monks who were very serious wanted to get away from the towns, and they went out into the wilderness. It wasn't the desert, it was the forests and all that. Then they'd make a little place for themselves, one or two of them, then others were attracted, then other people came, then it turned into another town, and then they had to leave, and they kept going. And this is the way it kind of spread out there. So it was it was like John Billington, I can't remember, I'm losing his name right now, the American historian who wrote about them. But he talks about the sort of monastic settlers who had an icon in one hand and an axe in the other. So they were like, clearing the forests and setting them up, and then, creating the sort of, the monastery there, as it were, and then a town would grow up.
Yeah, but I think the story of Ivan the Great brings about the question, which I've wondered, many have wondered, is the idea of, and you bring it up, is why do Russians love a tyrant? It seems to be the trope. I mean, in the case of Ivan the Terrible, he decides he's going to pull a Greta Garbo and go to a monastery. He's taking his toys and he's not going to be the czar, even though he's already a tyrant. And they beg him to come back and then give him even more power. I mean,
well, as I said, this is something that, depending on the authorities you're reading, it seems to be something that's part of the, the Russian character. Berdyaev blames a lot of that on the Mongols when they were under the Tartar yoke, and this kind of, this kind of a total obeisance to the Khan, and that's where you have them, bowing their heads on the floor and all this kind of thing, and a real kind of obvious sort of compliance and submission, and well, and again with Ivan the Terrible, and that was the other thing too, is that he wanted to show that he was on par with the great rulers of Europe. It's a story when the Holy Roman Emperor at the time wanted to kind of calm him down by giving him a kind of title, and he said, I have no need of you, of your titles. I'm well, they say they claim this descent from Rome. There's all these different stories where there's a descent, an actual kind of descent from Rome. There's Vladimir's marriage into the sort of Roman blood, but then there's early stories that anchor, some less tenuous than others, but they kind of anchor, the Russian world in Roman sort of Roman roots. So he had to show that he was as powerful and dominant as the others were. And I mean, the great switch in that is with Peter the Great. Later on. Well, it's only apt that the great switch should be with Peter the Great. But when he it makes this attempt to become westernized, and the ruler is no longer this sort of figure of God's regent on earth. I mean, that was, Ivan was, if you disagree with him, you're disagreeing with God, and the other czars as well. And this changes with Peter because he is westernized. He doesn't see it like that at all. I mean, he has the same authority. He wants to claim it's the same authority, but it's got nothing to do with any kind of religious representation. And he wants to lose all that pomp and everything like that. So that's the switch. And this is the other kind of polarity that going on in the book is, are we Western or aren't we? And it kind of, yes we are, no we're not, kind of thing that most recently, I guess, happened in the 90s.
Yeah, and for the audience, definitely check out his chapter on Ivan the Great is something else, from his death to all his shenanigans. The creator of the first secret police in history. I mean, what a character! He's like King Joffrey in Game of Thrones or something like that. I wonder where to. Complex character. Yeah, and as you say, later on in the Enlightenment period with Peter the Great, then things change in Russia. Doesn't it become more secular? I think you write about Catherine the Great. She was a friend with Voltaire. She was the Russians were allowing Freemasons. So then Russia in that time seems to reject the whole God thing and becomes more secular.
Well, I mean, as I said, Peter wanted to westernize it. That's St. Petersburg was built. It's supposed to be the window on the West, and it's not a natural, organic kind of city, as you could say Moscow was, or Kiev. It was planned. It's like New York in the sense that it's a grid, and it's planned on places like Amsterdam, and he wanted a seaport. Russia was landlocked, and the only other ports are up in the north, and it was frozen most of the time. And so there he could get, it was around Finland and into the sea and all that. And so this is what he built it there, and it's a swamp. And so he just created this city. So it was like one of the most, and one of the stories is that you couldn't build with stone anywhere else in Russia at the time when he was building St. Petersburg. So any stone that could be used for any kind of, building would be sent there to be used for all the buildings that, he wanted. And like, say, Alexander, who never really saw Alexandria, or actually Constantine didn't get a very, well, I guess he saw some of Constantinople, but St. Peter didn't see that much of St. Petersburg. It was the ones who came after him, Anne, Catherine the Great, and this was the influence of the French too at that time. That, there was all the French manners at the court, and yes, and Freemasonry was one of the things that was happening. There's all this bunch of talk, discussion whether Peter himself was ever initiated into Freemasonry or not, but there's, he could very well have been when he was in England. There's a story on this sort of journey he took to England, and he was in disguise, but it was hard not to know it was him because he was something like 6'6" or something, and he was like, not too many people were that tall. No matter what, he was dressed up as a worker or something, he would stand out. And apparently, this story that he was initiated there. And again, he too, apparently had a library and close friends that were very interested in all these occult, stuff that was happening at the time. There's no reason why they wouldn't have been. It was something that was just in the air. It was intelligent people that were interested in things who were reading these sorts of stuff, and so he would collect all that. There's supposed to be some library that he had that was sealed up somewhere. That I don't know. It's all sort of rumors that KGB found it at one point or something like that, but I don't know. Maybe Vance might. I don't know.
Not me.
Right behind you, Vance.
No ties to the KGB. Yeah, there it is. That's the secret library. Oops.
Yeah, you're
Let
in
it slip out of my secret file.
And yes, well, for the audience, we are trying to just go through Gary's book through history, but it's so rich. But you start to
much. Yeah.
I mean, we're trying just to show in an
Jump
interview
around.
more the sort of the evolution of the Russian psyche, and it's fascinating. So now we've got the Enlightenment, and then in the 19th century, what starts to happen? I think that's when Russia really becomes fascinating, especially with philosophy and metaphysics.
Yeah. Well, I think the 19th century is sort of the Russian century in one sense. And I mean, we mentioned Freemasonry briefly. I mean, initially Catherine Great was open to it, but then with the Illuminati scare,
right.
she closed down on it and clamped down. And I mean, there's some good sections in the book about that, because actually in the late 18th, early 19th century, Freemasonry and Martinism as well, like with Louis-Claude de Saint-Martin, unknown philosopher, his ideas, and Karl von Eckharthausen and Franz von Bader, and all these people's ideas were informing either people in the court, or even like Alexander the First, who was had contact with lots of ideas and all that. But Catherine, yeah, she closed down on it once the Illuminati scare had happened. And there was one really interesting. I mean, the other thing too, there's all these interesting characters that you never hear about. I mean, you hear, there's ones you do know, but then this Nikolai Novikov, who was this Freemason at the time. I mean, he was a remarkable character, and who sort of took the progressive, egalitarian, brotherhood of man sort of aspect of Freemasonry, which in an early part in her reign, her career, Catherine too, she had drawn up these proposals actually to change things. But the problem was and remained until mid-19th century were the serfs. What are we going to do about the serfs? And it was like, their plight was absolutely horrific. And that's why you do, that's the thing that you said, what happened in the 19th century was that it became just inescapable. What do we do? Because you have this vast mass of people that are living this substandard kind of way, that are owned by the landowners. But the people in power know that if they freed them, the landowners would revolt and all of that. And, the economy would break down. All the reasons you'd get now for whatever, you're going to say, well, we have to have low paid people. So the same thing, you'd have them there. And then eventually it just came to where, they did yeah, they were freed, and it didn't change that much, but it fed into, the resentment and animus that would eventually explode in the early 20th century. But yeah, and you get what happens is this remarkable flowering in Russia. It's kind of like a renaissance happens. And I mean, the Silver Ages appeared at the end of the 19th century, where everything is kind of almost overripe. There's a kind of decadent character to it. It's almost too rich. But say the mid, but you have, the great, Tolstoy's writing, and so many other, and they're all fueled by this moral sense. And it's, in a way, the kind of what do you want to call it? The sense of value and meaning, the existential questions that the West had left behind when it jettisoned religion mostly, and was careening more and more towards the materialism, which we're the heirs of that, and we live in that world now. It saw the kinds of questions that Dostoevsky was, becoming hysterical about from some perspective, as kind of just very overwrought sorts of things. But this is what the Russian soul was becoming aware of, this whole kind of plight of, and you have greats like Tolstoy, where and Gogol before him. I mean, Dead Souls is I mean, there's another, as I said, I talked before about this kind of somnolent, lethargic side to the Russian, character. You have something like that in all of these depictions of these, Russian towns out in the sticks, where nothing happens until page 300, where the music decides to blow his brains out or something. It's like P.G. Wodehouse makes a joke about that in one of his stories. And I mean, again, that's a cliche. So you have, and Gogol's writing about that, and it's whole we have to change things. What can we do to change things? Becomes incredible pressure. And I said Gogol had, end of his career, he rejected all of his art and went on this pilgrimage. He wound up basically dying of malnutrition or something like that. And then Tolstoy rejects all of his work at the end, and he goes on this last mad pilgrimage, from his home, and they find him at the train station, and all that. So there's this powerful, obsession with these questions of meaning and purpose that the West was just, completely ignoring, and all that. There's a very different kind of art. We have Flaubert and Tolstoy. I mean, there's a kind of gospel of art in Flaubert, but it's this kind of precision. It's the precision of the art. And Tolstoy is writing these essays like, what is art? What's the use of art, basically? If not to save us. The Russians want to be saved by their art. Again, its beauty will save the world. They don't want to be entertained. They don't want to be entertained by it. They want to be saved by it. It has to have this transformative power, or it's just, it's just kind of glitter.
Yeah, and I love how you write about the idea of the beautiful soul, something that seems to completely forgotten in the West. You even talk about how we've become so obsessed with the anti-hero, and you say, well, what's wrong with Superman and Sherlock Holmes? But you write very well, Gary, and I don't know who you're quoting. You talk about how in writing, it's easy to write a bad guy, but it's very hard to write a good guy. And the Russians seem to be the artists and thinkers. They were always looking for that good guy, that beautiful soul.
Yeah, I mean, beautiful soul is an actual, in the 19th century, where these characters who thought that they saw, again, the plight of the serfs and all the inequities in society and all of that. But they thought they could teach by example and change things by setting an example. And so they were cultured, but they were basically kind of saintly. I mean, they weren't actual figures from the church, but they were very much like sort of these German Romantic kind of characters too. The poet Novalis or something like that. It's kind of this kind of idealized, world of poetry and art and beauty and all this kind of thing. And so they thought to teach by example. And I mean, they did have some effect, but this is something and you talk about the difficulty in I mean, these guys live the life. So if there's a difficulty writing about it, it's, you know, how easy was it to live it? But no, but there's the thing with I talk about Dostoevsky, because in the Brothers Karamazov, well, there's two. Dostoevsky takes two shots at like portraying this beautiful soul. One is Prince Mishkin in The Idiot, and he, like Dostoevsky himself, he's epileptic, so he has these seizures, and before the seizure, he has this transformative experience where all is good. That's the other thing that runs through it, that the all is good kind of state that Dostoevsky tried to capture or recapture. And but the other one was Alyosha and the Brothers Karamazov, who's the monk brother. Have you ever seen the old 60s movie? William Shatner, Captain Kirk, plays Alyosha. He plays the monk. He plays the religious visionary. It's funny because in that film, he's one of the three. There's the three Karamazov, and then in Star Trek, it's the three as well, because it's Kirk, Spock, and McCoy.
Oh my God!
And then it's Ivan, Alyosha, and Dmitri. So it's Yul Brynner's Dmitri. And
oh wow!
Ivan is Richard Basehart. So if you ever get a chance, it's made in the 60s. And Lee J. Cobb plays the father. It's one of these great old 60s epic kind of ones. But any case, so Alyosha is this other attempt at, you know, and Dostoevsky had a plan for a sequel to the Brothers Karamazov. It was supposed to be about Alyosha, because he has this mystical experience at the end of the book, and then he's supposed to be going out to the world. And then we don't actually see him out in the world and what happens. And so Dostoevsky had planned a sequel to tell us like how it worked out for Alyosha, but he didn't get around to writing it. And Gogol too, he tried to do a sequel to Dead Souls. Dead Souls is a story about how a landowner, well, it's a story about someone who goes around. The souls are, if you have serfs among your property and they die, it's not until the next census that's taken that they're counted as dead. And so people somehow can collect them in some way. It's this weird thing. And so a character in the book goes around somehow talking landowners into letting him have the kind of the property rights to his dead souls. So he's going around from different estates buying up the dead souls and all that. So, and this is a metaphor, you know, for Russia and all that. So, but then Gogol he tries to write up, it's basically showing this kind of rather petty, small, trivial, self-centered character of the Russian kind of, you know, the non-urban kind of Russian character. But then he wanted to write a sequel to it showing the good Russian character, but then he gave it up. He wrote some stuff, there's a few chapters, and then he gave it up, and then he went on his religious quest. So it's something that they tried to do, and, you know, it's not only the Russians who, you know, it's very difficult to do when you think about it. You know, there's dozens of fantastic portrayals of villains and bad guys, or anti-heroes, or, you know, very, because being good is boring. There's nothing dramatic about it. You know, you go around blessing a couple people, but then after that, it gets kind of dull. It's all the, you know, but all the struggle is what is interesting for us, all the drama and the struggle and that kind of thing. So it's like the German philosopher Fichte, who said, you know, to be free is nothing, to become free is everything. So this is, you know, so that's this. We can go off on that, but Colin Milsom gets a lot out of that one. But yeah, so there was this difficulty where they were trying to do this, and what happened is, like, eventually you get the next generation, they're completely lost patience with these beautiful souls going around, showing how, you know, noble we all should be, and they want to change things no matter what it takes, you know, whatever, by any means necessary. And these are the new men, and these are the nihilists who are coming in, who, again, they've absorbed this Western notion that, you know, science tells us, positivism tells us that, you know, values and meaning and all that, this is just illusions. You know, what's real are atoms and molecules and and statistics, and you have to plan the scientific society, and we just have to be ruthless and apply, you know, this criteria to cleaning up this mess, because it's nothing but muddle. It's just absolute muddle and all this kind of thing. So, I mean, in one sense, Peter the Great was trying to do that, but these guys were impatient. And again, Dostoevsky is the one who nails it in his novel, The Devils, or it's also translated as the demons or the possessed. And it's about, a band of these characters coming to a town, and at the end, everything is up in flames, and there's several people have committed suicide and been killed and all that. So, I mean, in one sense, in a spiritual sense, I think you could, and I'm sure someone has, written a kind of spiritual history of Russia just through the lens of Dostoevsky's novels. I think someone like Radoyev has probably done something like that. Although, I mean, he's not as valued here anymore as he was. I mean, there's been, quite a few over the years. Oh, who's the least read great novelist now? It's like Dostoevsky. Oh God, he's so shrill and hysterical and all this kind of thing. But, what does that say? Does that say something about him? Or does that say something about us, that we've become very inured to these kind of existential questions that, kept him up at night? We're so post everything. So we're never beyond all that.
You were talking about the next generation, the nihilists that came, the materialists. There's one quote that made me laugh, and I forget who you're quoting, Gary, but you say a nihilist is someone who believes in nothing, but doesn't do anything about it.
Yeah, no, it's Jacques, it's the historian Jacques Barzin who said a real nihilist believes in nothing and does nothing about it.
but then later, of course, you read a chapter later and you see you make a great case, or you present how Lenin and Stalin were nihilists, they were materialists, and they did a lot. I mean, there was Lenin's, I think the perfect line, you said, Lenin, his purpose, it was a war against subjectivity. That was what fueled him. Anything is like the anti-Hassan Sabah or something. There was only no free will, no choice. This is the way the world was.
Everything is true and nothing is permitted.
Right.
I mean, in that sense. Well, I mean, this was the thing. I mean, if you talk about these characters, the new men, and then, a generation or so after them is the generation who's reading Marx. And I mean, Lenin is one of these who, I mean, again, it's something, it was all many ways new to me, and it was fascinating. And you have all these, so many different characters in there we're skating over. People like Alexander Herzen, who's like one of the greats at the time, and Belinsky, who was this literary critic, who, I mean, there's another thing, like the one thing that was kind of open, during, both during during the Tsar, the years of the Tsar, and then also during the Bolshevik times, was kind of literature. And so a lot of these political and social kind of wars were fought out in the realm of sort of essays and literary criticism and things like that, And so you have a generation doing that, and they're all trying to solve this problem of how do we do this, and it's trying to square the circle, because it's about, okay, we want, we're spiritual beings, we have an interiority, we have inwardness, and religion and whatever, mysticism or Freemasonry, that gives us some sense of that and keeps that alive. At the same time, we have to eat. We have to have decent living conditions. There's millions of people out there who, live worse than our animals do. And there's this, horrible system that's, so how do we put those two things together? Because they seem antithetical. I mean, this is why, in the 1940s, you have someone like Arthur Koestler, wrote a book called The Yogi and the Commissar. So it's like, and it's the same kind of thing. That polarity is being worked out in the 19th century in Russia, in areas of like literary criticism and writing and literature and things of that sort. And and then you get this generation where it's the idea that you just have to ruthlessly apply the notion that just the material world is the only real thing. The only real thing that matters is it's sort of fundamentally the greatest good or the greatest number. I mean, there's different ways you approach that, but that's more or less, I would say, the general kind of aim at the background. And you just ruthlessly approach this, and we're even more new than the new men. And the whole idea of creating this revolutionary elite, this band of the elite guard who are willing to do whatever it takes. It doesn't matter anything. Killing someone, blowing something up, will do it. And then they seize power, and they know they have to hold the power for a certain amount of time until the revolution is over. 70 years later, or whatever. You know what I mean? Like the revolution never, that's the whole thing. Is the revolution over yet? It's like, well, no, we haven't had time yet to introduce the classless society completely and all
right
that
around the corner,
kind of thing.
Right around the corner.
Well, again, this is the thing, the 19th century, they were philosophers and writers all about that, saying, the whole idea of people now going through some immense suffering in order to make possible some future, utopian state, which they themselves are never going to, be part of. This is the sort of thing like, well, no, but then that was what fueled, so much of the later Bolshevik and when it really got going in the 20s and all that. And again, at that time, even by the time it's well established, there's a whole, sub section of the intelligence agencies. They're interested in things like ESP and what's happening in Tibet and all this other kind of stuff. There's that interesting book, Red Shambhala. I reference it in my book about all that stuff going on in the KGB there, and all the different attempts, and like people like Nicholas Roerich, the great painter and explorer, I guess, ethnographer, but also mystic, and his attempts to establish a kind of independent Buddhist nation in Inner Mongolia, and trying to get support, from the Bolsheviks to do this, and the whole idea of a kind of communist Tibet, and all these sorts of things are happening in different ways. And there were people who did really think, yes, up in Tibet, they have the spiritual teaching, which we should be able to bring back with us and transmit to all the comrades, so that we all can live together in harmony. So they're really taking this seriously, that we can kind of adopt, kind of Buddhist notions in order to spread, kind of the true idea of the communist or, community. And then they also supposed to have the super science there, and it's the kind of thing like Lamsong Rampa, what was it called? Cave of the Ancients, one of his books, where he talks about, yes, in a cave somewhere up in the Himalayas, there are all these fantastic devices of future technology, but the world is not yet ready for them, and they will be kept hidden until the time. And they, people in the KGB and the other intelligence agencies there in the government, they believed something like that was the case, and they funded, expeditions to go there, things of that sort.
Yeah, and obviously, I think the Roosevelt, I think, you write it in Politics of the Occult, the Roosevelt administration, one of the guys in Roosevelt's cabinet also funded one. Everybody wanted to get to Shambhala.
Yeah, that was the second. That was Rorick's second attempt. He tried to do it in the 20s, and he tried to do it in the 30s. So he was very determined.
Yeah, well, they were looking at. Gary, do you have a few more minutes? I know we're a little past an hour, just for a few audience questions.
A couple. Yeah, sure. Yeah, we kind of went through a kind of history of Russia. There's a hope. There won't be a test. There won't
be a test. No, definitely get the book. Vance, do you have a question or any of the questions from the audience? I saw a few scroll up.
I'll defer to the questions to the audience, since I buffered up a few. Let's see, which one should I pick first? Is it true that the plague didn't really hit Russia to the same extent that it did the West, and this meant the serf class and the feudal hierarchy continued without reform? In other words, I think what he's saying is that if the plague didn't hit Russia as much, they kind of stuck in the Middle Ages longer.
That could be the case. I don't know for sure, to tell you the truth. So can you give me a multiple choice question? Next one.
Okay. The pilgrimage culture seems to have strong parallels in A, Tibet, B, Mongolia, C, Nevada.
Nevada.
Yeah. Well, Area 51, that's our Tibet, right?
They just had an earthquake. So
all the secrets are hidden there. Yeah, that's true. 6.5, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Tibet and Mongolia, actually, he said. So pilgrimage culture, are there parallels to it?
I thought you were joking. Oh, okay.
No, I took a real question and made it multiple choice.
You said Nevada, so I thought, okay, this has to be a joke.
Oh, my bad.
I'm sure there are. I'm not saying it's peculiar just to Russian culture, but it is something that's very much a part of it, because it is such a vast country.
And it's landlocked, right?
Yeah, yeah.
As far as
It's the mother of all continents. I mean, this is the Eurasia idea. The Eurasia idea is that as the West is in decline and has been for the last century or so, Russia is going to emerge in the 21st century, not as a new nation, it already has, but as a new civilization. And this is the Eurasian idea, which it's no longer a backward appendage to Europe, or a backward cousin trying to catch up. It's a completely new civilization, and with its own sense of values, its own spirit, its own aims and goals, and all this kind of thing. And yeah, so that's the saying. This vast landmass. This is something that has not only geographically, but there's a spiritual character to it. It imbues the people that inhabit it with a peculiar kind of being. Again, this goes back to what was being said about Russia in the late 19th, early 20th century, that there's some peculiar kind of alchemy of cultural mixes and things of that sort going on there that will emerge in the new cultural epoch. This is what like Steiner was referring to it. So yeah, my answer is yes.
Alrighty.
Somebody, I just saw a question when he does answer in his book. Have you spent time in Russia, Gary? I know the answer.
I haven't. No. But I used to live in the East Village in New York, and there was a lot of Ukrainian restaurants there. And I used to go and have a bowl of borscht and challah bread and read Dostoevsky at 2 in the morning. At 2 in the morning at the Kiev coffee shop on 2nd Avenue and 6th Street. It's no longer there.
Wow, and it was open at 2 in the morning. That's awesome.
Oh yeah, that's back when New York was New
York. Really? Okay, I got another one for you. Do you think the Russian Orthodox are allowing paganism to rise, or is it happening in spite of them?
I don't think they can stop it. I mean, I don't know how. It's. I mean, as far as I know, I mean, I've done the book, so it's not like something I keep up with all the time. But my impression that was when I was looking up on contemporary things when I was actually writing the book. It seemed that there were some, who, as you would have in the West, some people complaining about it. But I mean, one of the things I talk about in the book is there's this notion of double belief, devovery, which is supposed to be part of the Russian character, where this is why they were able to sort of assimilate the Greek Orthodox onto the sort of pagan matrix that was there. Even though, Vladimir toppled, the pagan gods, there's famous stories about him pushing over the statues into the river and things like that. The people themselves were able to somehow blend the two things together. And that's one reason, say, like Mary is very popular in the Russian soul, sort of related to damp Mother Earth and a variety of, the Black Madonna and things, all that kind of stuff. So there was a sense where they were able to sort of bring the two together. So, I mean, again, I don't want to say, all throughout Russian history, the pagan was there. I don't know if that's the case or not, but I assume, as it is the case in other places too, where the old beliefs never quite die out, and people are still. I mean, I would think, again, I'm not an expert on this time, but I would think during the Soviet years, when, say, religion was, and this maybe goes back to what you asked earlier, was, repressed or frowned upon, that just as when the Mongols had conquered Russia and dominated them for a few centuries, it was the religion that kept the people together and gave them an identity. They remained, because even though the Mongols, dominated them, they were remarkably tolerant about religion, and they were very interested in all different religions. They were Christian Mongols, so they were weird, Nestorian. They were Nestorian sort of Christians, and so as long as you pay tribute and basically kowtow to us, you can carry on with your beliefs. And it was the religion, the Greek Orthodox that they had adopted, that kept them together. It was this kind of glue. So I would think similarly, during the time you were talking about, there would be something that would happen too.
Oh, very good. Here's one I just got to read it. It's because it's a complex question. The symbolists and futurists were into the New Age, cosmic consciousness, and the new man. How did these themes become secularized and displaced onto the communist revolution?
Well, some of them were. I mean, people like Mayakovsky, and Mayevich, who were early futurists. The symbolists. One of the ideas on the symbolist, philosophy of art was that art should have a transformative experience. As I said, going back to the icons, and beauty will change the world. So, and because it worked in symbols, it was supposed to have a subliminal effect. So, the Bluebird, Maeterlinck's play, or plays someplace by Strindberg and others, where it's not a straight drama, but it's all done in there's symbols and metaphors and things of that sort, and it's supposed to have some effect. So the idea was that they could, the agitprop could use symbolist techniques in order to spread the message, and that later morphed into people like Gorky, because he believed in telepathy and mental science, actually being able to use paranormal, parapsychological means to spread the message, direct, mental transmission. So it went from symbolist art tactics used to subliminally get the message across to, yes, and that in many ways parallels the switch from symbolism to cubo-futurism. Because symbolism in general, what it wants to do is hint at this other world. It wants to suggest it. It never wants to pinpoint it exactly. You say, ooh, so there's a shimmer of the something else over there, and that aura attracts you. But the cubo-futurists, again, they were very impatient. Talk about the new man. They wanted to create this new world, and it had all hard angular surfaces. It was very modern, very geometric. They were influenced by Ouspensky's ideas about higher space and dimensions and things of that sort. Mayevich was certainly, and poets like Klebnikov. But they, Klebnikov, Velmir Klebnikov, one of these crazy characters who obsessed by time and this notion of different ages and different sort of time cycles. And then he was adrift, during the Civil War, walking around Russia carrying all of his poems in a pillowcase that he used to sleep on at night. And then he died of malnutrition. Mayakovsky, blew his brains out when he realized he was being used. Mayevich did okay. He kind of fit in, and he designed Lenin's, or he came up with the idea of sort of a Lenin's tomb, which I forget the architect's name who actually designed it. So, I mean, there was a period, in the early days, and there's a lot of anthroposophists who felt that, we can work with these people. In the early days, they were kind of like fellow travelers, say the first year or two, until about 22, when Lenin packed all of the philosophers and poets and historians and other writers, and that he couldn't kill because the press would be too bad, but he didn't want them in the country anymore. And he put them on the philosophy steamers, and he sent them out, to Germany. And this is how Berdyaev wound up first in Berlin and then in Paris, and then many, many others. And at that point, he kind of cracked down on the anthroposophical, he banned all that kind of stuff. But in the early days, it worked, it worked with it. So, I mean, the sense of the new, oh yes, change, everything's going to be different now. And everybody, gets in that tide, everyone's part of that tide. And then, the tide draws back, and then you see what's left on the shore. And then, it's not the same thing, but that initial, it's the same thing with the French Revolution. Bliss it was to be there then, but, to be young was very heaven. I'm paraphrasing, but, this whole idea, yes, it was these tremendous times of historical change, and then they don't necessarily turn out to be quite what you thought they were.
Doesn't seem they ever do. I think the leaders of the movements are the ones who make out, and the other guys, well, let the chips fall where they may.
Well, they're helping us along. They're the ones who give us the prod to keep civilization going. Otherwise, we would just be enjoying ourselves. And we don't want that. That would be horrible.
All right, awesome. One last question, Gary. We'll wrap up. I don't know if you can answer this. Is from Oz. Oh, Spangler is here. Awesome. He made an appearance. Yeah, I don't know if you addressed it in this book. I know you don't address it in Dark Star Rising, but if you can squeeze it, I'm quoting him.
Okay.
What does Gary think about South American Dugonists starting to invade online American left-wing circles?
I think we should écraser l'enfant, as Nietzsche said, quoting Voltaire. I know nothing about them, but it doesn't sound like a good business. So sounds like a rum business, as they used to say, and someone should put a stop to it.
Yes. There's a lot going on. So awesome. This has been a great conversation. So as I
All right,
always
well, thank
ask you,
you.
what are you working on next before we go?
Currently, I'm working on a book about precognitive dreams. Something I've been recording for about 40 years now. So been going over those, and yeah, that's what I'm doing now.
Awesome. Wow.
But
talked to Eric Wargo. He's done a lot of work on that.
Yeah. I read his book, and it's interesting. I'm not convinced by his argument, but it's an interesting book nonetheless. And we had a brief exchange on Twitter.
Oh, good deal.
But it's kind of a personal view, so I'm not trying to explain it. I'm trying to say, well, this is how it's happened to me, and here's what I think about it.
Awesome. Well, we look forward to it. Well, audience, again, the audio version will be out. Thank you very much for your questions and your comments and your support. Appreciate it all. Definitely get Gary's book. We barely scratched the proverbial surface. There's a lot more, and it's really it's a wonderful journey, the history of consciousness, history of meaning, and you'll have much more insight on the Russian psyche and really how the world is and the way the world is going. So very nice. For first, Vance, thanks for keeping things together there in Kiev or Russia, wherever you are.
Hi, Barry. I'm floating around. My pleasure.
I noticed you get around with somebody.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess the lockdown's not where you are, right?
No.
He's part of the league. He doesn't walk the walk.
Oh, good for you.
There's no viruses.
Okay. All right. Well, thanks for having me on again. And take care, everybody.
All right. Take care. Thanks, everybody.
You too, Gary.
Das Vidania. Spasibo.
Very good. Very
Thank you, Gary. Always love it.